Vatic Pro has been going on an absolute tear this year with probably some of the best value paddles on the market right now. They've upped the price a bit, but also released an absolute banger with the brand new Alchemy. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. Now, it's no secret that Vatic Pro has kind of knocked it out of the park this year. Their thermoform paddles are fantastic, and they delivered on that promise of releasing a paddle under that $100 price point with the Prisms. They've sold a lot of paddles, and they reinvested some of that money into developing the very cool looking Alchemies. Now, right off the bat, these paddles are very different because of this pretty obvious hole right in the middle. Selkirk were the first to try this out, and suffice to say, it was a winning bet because the Vanguard Power Airs are very successful. Now, before we go on, remember that any of the paddles we mentioned here you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca, and please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know down in the comment section what you want me to cover next. Now let's talk about some specs. The Alchemy comes in a 13.5 and 16mm core. The one I'm holding here is the 13.5, and the paddle is 16.5 inches long with a 5.5 inch handle. Now the weight is actually pretty interesting because there's this removable rubber piece covering the hole. I'll remove it to show you that it's actually possible to remove, but the paddle weighs between 8.3 and 8.5 ounces with it, and between 8 and 8.3 ounces without it. We are going to cover a ton of playability characteristics today because we are talking about two very unique paddles here. We'll touch on feel, spin, power, control, maneuverability, and talk about who they might be best for. Interestingly enough, the most unique playability characteristic of the Alchemy is not the swing pattern or the maneuverability, it's how the actual paddle feels on contact. Now first of all, I just want to say I absolutely hated the feel of this rubber guard in the middle here. The paddle felt spongy, springy, it actually felt rubbery, and it was just way too different to what I was used to. I instantly took it out, hoping that it would make a difference, and honestly it did. It felt way more normal, I guess you can say, and honestly I think most people will prefer it this way. If you do like the static weight and swing weight with the rubber piece, just add that weight back in lead, but when I say that the paddle feels more normal without the rubber piece, it still doesn't feel much like anything else I've tried. The paddle's flex is very unique. Most paddles feel like it's the core that cushions the ball on impact, but with the Alchemy, it feels like the whole paddle is flexing as one, and you really only get it to flex a lot when you're hitting hard. So it's kind of like the paddle is flexy and soft when you're hitting full-on ground strokes, but then super instantaneous and springy when you're hitting softer paced touch shots. It's very different. Honestly, at the beginning, I was pretty taken aback by this sensation, and it's pretty much all due to the massive hole in the middle because that's what allows the paddle to flex so much. As I got more used to it though, I realized it's kind of a similar sensation to how a tennis racket flexes, which is why I think the 16 and 13.5mm Alchemies are probably the most similar paddles to a tennis racket, which I know is a really weird thing to say. They just have this really good feel on fast, full-paced ground strokes where you get the whole paddle to flex and feel like you can almost place the ball exactly where you want, almost like a tennis racket. But let's go back to pickleball here because traditional soft pickleball control is not the same as control with ground strokes, and the Alchemies are definitely not as good with that traditional control. In fact, on the 13.5 here, soft control is basically non-existent. It's better on the 16, but still not as good as even the stiffer 16mm paddles like the V7 and the Flash. It goes back to that instantaneous and springy sensation and the fact that the paddle doesn't really flex unless you're hitting hard, so you don't get much softness at all. I played most of the time with the 13.5, and honestly, my dinks were kind of all over the place, especially at the beginning. I'm already not the best in the soft game, but this was kind of on a whole nother level. Also, the sweet spot is pretty small and the paddle face is a bit unstable, again, probably due to the hole. It's actually kind of funny because the whole point of a thermoform unibody paddle is that they're the most sturdy and rigid paddles because the whole thing is made from one piece of carbon. It feels like putting a hole in the middle of all that kind of defeats that purpose, and the Alchemies definitely aren't as stable as other thermoform paddles. I guess it's just the trade-off you're gonna have to make to get that very unique flexy sensation. Now I do just want to say, these paddles don't have terrible stability. They're still long, heavy paddles with high swing weights, but compared to other paddles with similar specs, they're clearly not as stable. If you do want to make them softer and more stable, add lead to the bottom portion of the paddle face here. That'll kind of counteract the fact that there's a big hole right around there, and it'll also make the paddle feel softer. Maneuverability and swing pattern is the next big thing you're going to notice with the Alchemies, because putting a hole in the middle of your paddle is definitely going to alter its swing characteristics. Now they're definitely not as quick as Power Air Invictas, but they're noticeably quicker than they should be considering their extended length and high swing weights. Hand speed is high with the Alchemies. I took them out with the V7 and they were much more responsive, almost as if that hole is right where it needs to be to make the paddle pivot quicker. So I really like that about the paddle, but it's the unique swing pattern that I appreciated even more. Kind of like it was with the feel, it's it's the most similar swing pattern that I've ever felt to a tennis racket. If you look at a tennis racket, most of the material is concentrated in the hoop and in the handle. By putting a hole in the middle of the paddle, you're taking out material in the middle, therefore concentrating more of that material at the extremes like a tennis racket. It's quite logical, and coming from a tennis background myself, I really enjoyed the Alchemy swing pattern and got very dialed to my ground strokes and my serve, especially my forehand. Now obviously, if you feel comfortable hitting a full ground stroke the way I did with this paddle, you're naturally going to hit it with more spin. The Alchemies induce confidence hitting with spin because their shape complements that spinny style very well, but the paddles are more so spin friendly because of that swing pattern rather than because of any inherent spin potential the paddle actually has. Don't get me wrong, both the 13.5 and the 16 are inherently spin friendly, but I did feel a little bit less purchase over the ball than I do with other thermoform paddles. This is probably again because of the hole. It does take away from a bit of that rigidity on impact so the ball doesn't shoot out with quite as much spin, but it is still very good. Between the 16 and the 13.5, which one is more spin friendly? Well, honestly, the 13 is quicker through the air, so you get a bit more paddle head speed, but then the 16 has a bit more mass behind the ball and is still plenty rigid, so honestly they're pretty much equal. Now, if spin potential was marginally lower on these compared to other thermoform paddles, power is much more noticeably lower. It did take me a second to get used to that because I was kind of expecting huge power potential from a 13.5mm thermoform paddle, but on my first few shots the ball went directly into the net, and I think again that's because the hole is taking away from a bit of that energy on impact. Have I made it clear yet that most of this paddle's playability is centered around this massive hole in the middle? I feel like I have. Anyways, that lower power some people might see as a negative, but once I got used to it, I think I actually preferred it. When a paddle's too powerful, I don't feel super confident taking a massive swing at the ball, so that wasn't a problem here. The 13.5 is a bit more powerful than the 16, but it's an uncontrollably springy power more than it is any type of power you actually want, so it's not necessarily a good thing. If I haven't made it abundantly clear up till this point, I'll say it right now, these two paddles are perfect for you pickleball players who come from a tennis background. I'm one of those people, and once I got dialed into these paddles, I felt that they were working extremely well with my game, especially the 13.5 where I felt like I had total control over my ground strokes and volleys. Now the thing is, soft control is very important in pickleball, especially in doubles, so I will say these are probably primarily singles paddles. Either that or you're just going to have to work on your soft game big time. The 16 is obviously softer than the 13.5, but still it's not as good as a lot of other paddles, but honestly throughout the course of my playtest I really didn't care. My game is centered around controlling ground strokes from the baseline and then moving up to the net with speed and precision on volleys, and because this paddle is so good at that, I really didn't mind its slightly lackluster softness. The Alchemies are just such unique paddles with their swing pattern and feel that if you like the sensation they provide, you're really not going to find it anywhere else, which is why I think they're going to be extremely popular for certain players. I've been looking to switch to a new paddle and I definitely want to keep playing with it a little bit more before committing, but I like the 13.5 so much that I probably will sooner or later. With that though, that is going to be the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. Remember that if you do want to demo the Alchemies, you can come visit us in store or you can check them out online at racketsandrunners.ca.